today's study that is just being released, I believe today is the first public airing of the findings of this study, is sort of an update and an assessment of the state of the Joint Comprehensive Agreement on Iran's nuclear program. It has a very somber tone to it, I would say, and it has a point of view. We're drawing on deep expertise within IISS on everything from how countries can try to acquire nuclear weapons to the status and the relevance of ballistic missile programs that may or may not be formally linked to their nuclear programs. But the study takes a position on what are the consequences for regional and global peace and security of the current amorphous status of the JCPOA, with one of the key countries now an outlier and having abandoned or stepped out of the agreement. So I'm counting on Mark and Mike Elleman to share with us the highlights of this very serious and in-depth study. I'll then pose a few questions to them, and then we'll open it up to you. There's a lot of expertise in the room, and I really hope that many of you will also join in on your own thoughts on the relevance and the status of the JCPOA. So, Mark, welcome back home. You haven't gone for very long, and we're glad to see you back. So I think Mark's going to start, and then Mike will address the ballistic missile chapter, I believe. You're going to do the procurement chapter as well?
Just a bit, yeah.
And then we'll return to Mark for some of the policy recommendations.
Well, thanks very much, Ellen. Thanks very much, everybody, for being here. 10 years after I first wrote about Iran's nuclear program in my first Adelphi, I'm very pleased to have joined with my IISS colleagues, Mike and Paulina, to produce this latest Adelphi book. For those who have to leave early, there's a little bit of an echo here. The bottom line, excuse me, is that...
You need to turn yours off?
Mine is off.
Okay. So here's our conclusion. U.S. withdrawal from the Iran nuclear accord was reckless. It was a grave mistake that serves no political or serves no strategic purpose. The issues, and there are issues, the issues that President Trump raised for withdrawing from the deal could have been addressed while maintaining U.S. commitments to it. Withdrawing alarmed every partner of the United States, except for 4 of Iran's foes in the Middle East. It isolated the United States, and it undermined U.S. credibility around the world. Meanwhile, it needlessly increased the risk of nuclear proliferation and further conflict in the Middle East. So today, 3.5 years after its adoption, the JCPOA is in dire danger. Critics hated it from the beginning for 5 main reasons. It legitimized uranium enrichment by Iran. The enrichment limits that were set were time-bound. Immediate inspection was not required at any military base in Iran. The deal didn't address missiles and other non-nuclear issues. And Iran didn't have to admit to past nuclear weapons development work and give up its nuclear hedging strategy. These were all compromises that were necessary to get the deal and to get the steep reductions and the intrusive inspections that were key to the deal, something that sanctions alone never succeeded in doing. And nothing that's happened since the JCPOA came into being fundamentally alters these main arguments. So firstly, I think we all realize, I hope we all realize, that Iran has not cheated on the deal, and minor issues were being resolved. There have been politicized claims about Iranian violations, but they're demonstrably incorrect, except for 2 very minor and quickly rectified instances of excess heavy water production. Okay, we're going to do something different. Yeah, so except for 2 very minor and quickly rectified instances of the excess heavy water production and storage, Iran has consistently met all of its obligations under the deal. We go through each of the allegations of violations that were levied against the deal and refute each of them. Unfortunately, however, these false accusations contributed to Trump's strategy to pull out. The second main thing that's happened is that the atomic archive that Israel unveiled last year underscores what the IAEA concluded in November 2015, that contrary to its denials, Iran had been working on nuclear weapons development. It lied, and we now know how bigly. Maintaining those nuclear files was in keeping with Iran's nuclear hedging strategy. Their existence points to the key vulnerability of the JCPOA, the decision not to require Iran to acknowledge its past nuclear weapons development. Iran agreed to address questions about the matter, but whether its answers were satisfactory was left to the discretion of the IAEA. And Iran was opaque at best in its replies, and it constricted inspector access to the Parchin military base where nuclear development work had taken place. Nevertheless, the IAEA was able to conclude in November 2015 that Iran had in fact engaged in coordinated research on nuclear weapons. Given that the research took place in the past, the parties agreed not to let a lack of a full accounting delay implementation of the JCPOA in January 2016. This judgment planted the seeds for much of the condemnation that was to follow. Iran's careful storage of files detailing that research indicates that it has not ruled out resuming weapons development in the future. Now, that's a different conclusion than those who say the files indicate that Iran plans to develop nuclear weapons. We conclude that Iran is continuing a nuclear hedging strategy. Detecting and forestalling any resumption of the nuclear weapons development would be much easier to do with the deal than without it. Under the JCPOA, Iran accepted the most robust verification system anywhere in the world. Now, this system in Iran does not allow for any time, anywhere inspections, as some Obama administration officials had said. No undefeated sovereign state would allow unfettered access to all of its military bases. Instead, the JCPOA provided for IAEA inspections when needed, where needed. This right was clarified through an expedited inspection request process for complementary access to sites where the IAEA had legitimate questions about possible nuclear activity occurring since 2016 or anomalies in Iran's reporting under the JCPOA. There were anomalies previously, but we're talking about what is in the present tense. The IAEA insists that it has access to any location in Iran which it needs to see, and that this is not limited to civilian sites. Critics dispute this, citing claims by Iranian officials that military bases are off limits. Such claims by Iranian officials are made for domestic consumption, and they're belied by the fact that Iran has in the past allowed visits to military sites on over 20 occasions. Now, if the IAEA has not asked to go to any military sites since 2016, it's because no reporting anomalies have arisen that require such visits. I grant you that the Atomic Archive documents may change that. But for now, analysts need to be more careful about claims that Iran has denied access. They haven't. Short of trying to compel Iran to renegotiate the JCPOA to accept compromises that it consistently refused to accept during the negotiations, there are several ways in which the accord could be improved. Here are some suggestions. Firstly, the role of the IAEA should be clarified with regard to the verification of the unprecedented restrictions in so-called Section T on certain activities that would contribute to nuclear weapons development. Clarifying the IAEA's verification role would require diplomatic coordination with Russia, which so far has refused to endorse such verification. Secondly, this thorny issue of access to military bases needs to be addressed so that a prolonged absence of IAEA access to the bases doesn't set a negative norm. The IAEA should seek selective visits to military facilities in the context of working to reach the broader conclusion under the additional protocol. To draw this broader conclusion, the agency will need to put firmly to rest all lingering concerns about Parchin and any other sites where nuclear activity is suspected of having occurred in the past. The IAEA must also seek access to sites where the Atomic Archive documents indicate that nuclear weapons development was taking place or where equipment and documents were stored. That's a tough recommendation, but I think Iran has a incentive to want to allow such military sites for the legitimacy that would be provided by the broader conclusion. So I think there is a possibility it could cooperate with the IAEA. Thirdly, the remaining parties to the deal should also endeavor to keep in place the Procurement Channel, the subject of Chapter 2 of our book. This is the mechanism that was established under the JCPOA to monitor Iran's acquisition of nuclear-related material for the limited program allowed by the Accord. As explained by Paulina in her chapter, having such a legal mechanism helps curb illicit procurement. Despite a relatively low level of activity, the mechanism has been working. It does, however, need a proper investigative mechanism, especially given concerns that have recently arisen about some procurement of dual-use items outside the channel. We also offer recommendations and assessments about missiles, which Mike will address, and I'd like to turn the floor over to Mike now before coming back with a few final conclusions.
Let's see, did you turn your mic off as well? You want to try it?
Okay, can everyone hear me? All right. Maybe we'll have a little bit better luck with my microphone. Well, thank you, Ellen, for hosting us here at the IISS. It's a great opportunity to speak to all of you about the chapter that Mark and I wrote together. It was one of my what I've loved dearly about being at the IISS for the last 10 years is actually collaborating with Mark, and I hope this isn't our last collaborative effort, even though you have entered retirement. Now, many countries, view Iran's robust ballistic missile programs and capabilities with great concern, including both their near neighbors and those countries further afield. While neighboring states worry about the missiles, regardless of their payload capacity or even their lethality or capabilities, it is their potential ability to deliver nuclear weapons that is of greatest worry. Now, the decision by the negotiators of the JCPOA to limit the agreement to covering just the capabilities for producing fissile material and nuclear warheads and not the means for delivery, as Mark mentioned earlier, is one of the major criticisms of the deal itself. Now, although the Obama administration had wanted to include missile restrictions in the negotiations, this proposal or concept was rejected by China, Iran, and Russia, three of the negotiating partners. The Obama administration justified the exclusion of missiles on the grounds that if Iran is blocked from obtaining a nuclear weapon, then the missiles are not nearly as threatening. And this is, I guess, a conclusion that I would fully agree with. And if anyone is familiar with my writings over the year about Iran's missile capabilities, I think they would understand that conventionally armed missiles that are inaccurate have some strategic value to Iran, but they're not existential. Now, those that have been critical of the JCPOA frequently cite the agreement's failure to contain the missiles as a fatal flaw. So curbing missiles is one of the #1 priorities that the Trump administration has assigned as a negotiating parameter for any future negotiations with Iran. And he used it as a justification for withdrawing from the JCPOA. Now, it is often assumed that Iran's missiles have little purpose other than to be mated with nuclear weapons. Well, every country that possesses nuclear weapons has ballistic missiles that can fly further, or at least, if not further, than 2,000 kilometers. But it's also true that every country that has nuclear weapons also has strike aircraft, and most of them now have cruise missiles. Now, there's consensus that if Iran were to develop a nuclear weapon, a ballistic missile would be the primary means of delivery. But this assumption has not been subject to a rigorous technical analysis, and critics often fail to differentiate between the different various missile systems that Iran currently possesses or is developing. So what we attempted to do in this chapter was to examine whether and to what extent Iran's missiles are, quote, designed to be capable of delivering nuclear weapons. In other words, looking at Resolution 2231, which specifically has this wording. Now, the JCPOA itself does not address ballistic missiles, but UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which was adopted in July of 2015 to endorse the nuclear agreement, included provisions that place limits on some of Iran's missile activities. And if I may quote, Resolution 2231 says, Iran is called upon not to undertake any activity related to ballistic missiles designed to be capable of delivering nuclear weapons, including launches using such missile technology. So what does that mean? Well, the language clearly differs from previous Security Council resolutions, specifically Resolution 1929. Rather than saying the Security Council decides that Iran shall not undertake any missile-related activity, Iran is only called upon not to do so under the new resolution. Whereas 1929 prohibited activity related to ballistic missiles capable of delivering nuclear weapons, the new resolution added a qualifier, designed to be capable of delivering such weapons. And this raises the issue of intent. Intent is, of course, difficult to assess objectively, but reasonable answers, we think, can be reached, and we have attempted to do that in our work. Now, none of the terms in the phrase designed to be nuclear capable are defined in the resolution itself, nor are they defined by any other binding international instrument. Even the term nuclear weapons remains largely undefined in the Treaty for Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, treaty signed in 1968. So we began by looking maybe at the Missile Technology Control Regime. This is an informal, voluntary arrangement by about 35 countries. Tom, correct me if I'm wrong on that number. It was established in 1987 with the notion of curbing the spread of unmanned delivery systems for nuclear weapons and other WMDs. The guidelines call for a strong presumption of denial for exports for any missile technology or hardware that for a system capable of delivering a 500-kilogram warhead to a distance of 300 kilometers. These thresholds are commonly when you talk to most analysts, they will employ the Mtcr thresholds as defining what is inherently capable of delivering a nuclear weapon. Now, there's no disagreement between Security Council members on this rough definition of what is inherently capable. The disagreements, however, emerge when the issue of intent and whether specific missile systems were designed or not designed for nuclear weapons. For the sake of time, I'm just going to mention quickly some of the motivations that underlie Iran's missile programs and the importance it applies to it. Now, understanding these underlying motivations also will help explain why negotiators tabled the missile issue. So missiles are a central pillar, almost a foundational pillar for Iran's overarching defense and deterrence strategy, along with the use of proxy forces, asymmetric capabilities in the Gulf itself to threaten shipping. And emerging now, we have this cyber capability that Iran is trying to hone. Now, the missile component for this strategy derives from the security environment, pragmatic decision-making, and the lessons drawn from the wars that have been fought around the countries around Iran or with Iran. Beginning with the Iran-Iraq War, where it was unable to field its aircraft and had little capacity to retaliate against Saddam's missile and airstrikes on its cities and critical infrastructure. They were able to procure some Scud missiles from a variety of countries, and their retaliatory strikes actually led to a ceasefire, a missile ceasefire. It didn't last long, but it led to one. And so they saw the strategic value of the missile. This was underscored when Iraq began attacking Tehran late in the war, where a quarter of the population left the city, largely because of the missile strikes, but also because there was threats that they would contain chemical weapons. Again, in 1991, they saw Iraq use Scud missiles very strategically against Israel and the Gulf states, and they witnessed the inability of U.S. forces to interdict the Scud launchers on the ground, and they also took notice of the air dominance that the U.S. had. So for Iran, missiles are a strategic weapon to be used against large area targets because the missiles themselves do not have the accuracy to affect tactical targets on the battlefield. But Iran's thinking has changed, and if you look around 2003, they watched how long it took the U.S. to mobilize forces along the border of Iraq, and they saw a vulnerability, and they really have focused since about 2005, 2006 on increasing the accuracy of its battlefield weapons, namely the Fatah 110. So we're beginning to see this new strategy of Scud and Scud-type missiles for strategic missions and shorter range systems for tactical military missions. Now, it's clear that missiles serve a part of Iran's hedging strategy, or nuclear hedging strategy. The atomic archives revealed by the Israelis, feature a presumptive Iranian design inside a Shahab-3 warhead. The first-gen warhead is about 700 millimeters in diameter. I point that out for a reason, which I'll mention in a moment. So with these priorities and knowledge, we attempted to kind of look at what is designed, what is not designed to be military, or designed to be a nuclear delivery. Let's start with the Scud missiles. The Soviets initially designed the Scud as a nuclear weapons delivery platform, but they also realized that there was an export potential. The exported Scud has different dimensions than the nuclear Scud. The differences are small, but they are real. The export version can be distinguished easily, and that is what North Korea produces, or supposedly produces. It's what Iran has. And I think we can, based on that historical lineage, we can conclude that the Scud or Shahab 1 and 2 missiles that Iran currently has are really designed for conventional missions. It doesn't mean they can't be changed, but they are designed specifically for those things, and it's consistent with their military doctrine. So let's look at some of the other systems. You have the Icbm. This is a modified Scud-C. It has a different warhead shape or nose cone shape. That nose cone is too small. It's about 600 millimeters in diameter. It's too small to fit the presumptive nuclear design into that warhead. So I think it's logical to conclude or to assess that the Icbm is designed, again, for conventional delivery of conventional weapons. The Shahab 3, clearly, one could make the argument that this is a missile that's designed for nuclear delivery because we have evidence of Iran designing an integrated warhead with a nuclear weapon. But also, if you look at the design heritage of the Shahab 3, it was clearly designed by its original producers as a nuclear weapons delivery vehicle. It's also notable that the Shahab 3, if you scale up a Scud missile, its dimensions mirror those of the nuclear version of the Scud missile. The Goddard Missile, which is a modification of the Shahab 3, which came about in 2004, again, it has this small triconic-shaped nose cone. It's too small a weapons compartment to house a nuclear weapon, or Iran's nuclear weapon. So presumptively, we can conclude that it is designed for conventional use. The EMOD, which is a missile that's designed to be more accurate, they have a long way to go in achieving that, but it employs actually a Scud warhead with an integrating flange. It is technically, or in principle, one could fit the nuclear warhead into that design. However, it's unclear if it would be aerodynamically stable during re-entry for a variety of reasons. So we could not make a clear judgment as to what the design intent of the EMOD is. The Iranians claim it's designed to be a very accurate delivery platform by having a maneuverable warhead, but accuracy does not preclude its use as a nuclear weapon or nuclear delivery. Finally, we have the Haramshar. This is a much larger missile. The warhead could definitely fit inside it. It uses a different type of propellants. To me, this is the most worrying development I've seen in Iran in the last 5-10 years. It is based on the same technology the North Koreans were using for their Musadon. They haven't been terribly successful in exploiting the technology yet, but this is a weapon which, and the hardware with it, would be very suitable for scaling up and using as a platform developing an Icbm. I'll perhaps wait until the question and answer period to address the space launcher, especially given that Iran launched or attempted to launch a satellite using a very large carrier rocket 2 days ago.
Thanks, Mike.
So thank you.
And to Mark, back to Mark for some final thoughts.
Yeah, the title of the book is Uncertain Future. So I thought we should just spend 90 seconds on the future. Whether the JCPOA will survive long enough to incorporate any of the recommendations that we make is really up to Iran. So far, Iran has realized that staying in the deal is to its advantage. There are political and diplomatic benefits to being seen as the compliant party as opposed to the United States. And there's also a security consideration. If Iran were to leave the JCPOA, I think this would be considered as a signal of nuclear weapons development intentions that could very well trigger U.S. and Israeli military strike considerations. But how long the Iranian government can remain patient in adhering to the JCPOA is really uncertain, given the strong domestic pressure that President Hassan Rouhani faces from the hardliners and just not even hardliners. I've talked to a lot of Iranians who insist that as a matter of national pride, how can Iran continue to be taken advantage of by unilaterally adhering to a deal that the United States has broken? They talk about respect a lot, being treated equally and fairly. So actions by Europeans and other partners in trying to keep open some banking channels, I think will help keep Iran in the deal, even if they don't result in a great deal of economic benefit, because at least they will address this issue of respect for Iran's adherence. The JCPOA from today is in the 4th year of its implementation. It's hung on longer than a lot of observers expected after Trump's opposition replaced Obama's optimism. We, authors of this Adelphi book, believe that the world will be better off if the agreement continues in place it would be even better if it's improved along the lines suggested. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks, Mark, and thanks to Mike for such compelling opening presentations. I hope we'll move quickly to questions. I'm going to start us with one or two questions to both of the authors here, and I'm sorry that Paulina's not able to join us today. So I want to start with Mark on this global governance, you know, the landscape in which the JCPOA currently survives, as you said. Should we be worried about Russia and China sort of relaxing the implementation, sort of a further erosion of the discipline that the JCPOA began with? And I mean, you've made your argument that it's up to Iran of whether it stays. I'm just asking you to think about the other parties. The Europeans, I think, are quite committed, but they are torn as their own companies essentially, you know, acquiesce to U.S. preferences because of their own economic self-interest, even though the foreign ministries and defense ministries within the EU strongly believe that staying inside the JCPOA is the preferred route. So talk to us a little bit more about the IAEA and whether some of the other parties to the JCPOA are as committed to its survival with its original principles. And I wonder, in that, one of the criticisms that the Trump administration and others who didn't like the original agreement make is that wouldn't it have been better for it to have been a treaty right from the start? My understanding was that it didn't have to, there is a treaty, it's called the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that this was an agreement to get Iran back in compliance with its treaty obligations. So to have done this agreement also as a treaty is a peculiar concept, but I wonder if you want to say a few words about that.
Well, you know, every other party to the JCPOA is firmly committed to its continued implementation. They all see the security, the non-proliferation benefits from it. Many of them also see commercial benefits, but those are really not as important to the parties as the security and non-proliferation benefits. I wish that Russia was more proactive, however, in reinforcing the verification aspects of the deal. I think this would have really gone a long way toward addressing one of the main criticisms. You know, the Section T prohibitions on Iran for engaging in work that is related to nuclear weapons development is supposed to be verified by the IAEA, which is supposed to verify all the nuclear elements of the deal. But but Russia maintains that no, that the IAEA is not given that responsibility. So Russia refuses to engage in any ways to try to strengthen the verification. I think that's a big mistake by Russia. I've talked to the foreign minister himself about this, and I don't know why they're so unbending on this. You know, the other ways that some of the parties are sometimes seen as whether they can take actions that would strengthen the deal. You know, the French, the Germans, and the British all were engaged with the United States up until last May when President Trump withdrew from the deal, even though those parties had gotten very close to a way to address all of Trump's criticism. The only one they couldn't quite crack was his insistence that the deal go on forever. Which would have been a major fundamental change to the deal. That just wasn't on. But there were ways that they could have made the limits last longer by tying them to Iran's civilian energy needs. And you know, there was a way to do that, but Trump wasn't interested in any further deal.
Thank you. And Mike, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about where Iran fits in sort of the category of countries that have developed ballistic missiles. Is Iran similar to other countries in the way it's developed its ballistic missile capabilities, or are there some unique attributes? Since Iran is a country that has been isolated by sanctions for so many years, is there a stronger indigenous component? What are some other things we should understand about where Iran fits in the countries that are missile capable?
Well, Iran is certainly not as capable as you know, the P5 countries, for example, in terms of their missile development. They're probably somewhere just a notch below North Korea. It remains there's still a lot of mystery about North Korea's program and some of its origins. But what really has distinguished Iran when you compare it to other countries that have tried to develop ballistic missiles, including Iraq and where we see Syria before the civil war, is Iran takes a long-term approach. And unlike a lot of these countries, they have shown what I believe is very disciplined program management and engineering, systems engineering of the processes. I'm not saying they're anything comparable to what you'd see in Germany or the United States or another, highly advanced country, but they have systematically improved their capability. If you look at, they relied on the purchases of liquid propellant systems, the Scud and the Nodong from North Korea, but they've incorporated some rather substantial changes to transform them into more capable systems. They're adding, enhanced guidance systems, use different materials of construction to extend the range of the Scud C, and when you see it in the Icbm missile, again, the transformation of the Shahab-3 into the Goddard, and then assembling these systems differently to create their space launchers. I think their longer-term plans center on solid propellants. They've taken the manufacturing capacity that was provided to them by presumably China to make heavy artillery rockets, and they have used the experience and what I call the accumulated tacit knowledge, that is, actually learning from the production of small rocket motors to build larger ones. They've have the Sajil-2, it's a two-stage solid fuel medium-range missile. It's run into some sort of technical difficulties. They haven't tested it since 2011, but I think that they will systematically chip away at it. There's some evidence that they're building a facility in the desert to produce large solid rocket motors, so it remains to be seen. But what I would say is don't underestimate Iran's ingenuity. As someone in the audience told me from his experience flying F-14s, the fact that Iran can continue to fly F-14s is really remarkable. And I think that tells you a lot about their creativity, their technical capacity, and the ability to work within the resources they have.
Thanks. Patrick, I saw you first, but I want Patrick and then Bob Einhorn.
Patrick Lawson from the Washington Institute. Appreciate if either of you could address the question about the restrictions that Israel has placed on access to the nuclear archive that it holds, and what impact you think that has, and what do you think would be the pros and cons of Israel making that nuclear archive material more readily available? I mean, ideally, or even putting it on the internet. And second, Mark, you talked about clarifying the IAEA's role regarding Section T. Could you also discuss the pros and cons of clarifying the IAEA's role regarding the Procurement Channel? And in particular, if IAEA inspectors come across something which clearly was procured since the JCPOA came into effect and also was clearly not reported through the Procurement Channel, what should they do? Should they inform the Iranians about this? Should they inform the country from which the item came about this? Should this be mentioned in the Director General's reports?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. I'm not too concerned about the restrictions Israel has placed on the access to the documents. I think it's shared them widely with the IAEA, which is the most important body that needs to see and take action on them. I think it's good that some journalists and analysts have had greater access. Some of them have had to go to Israel to see that. I haven't had that chance myself. I think if I asked, I might. But the main thing is that at what stage should the IAEA take action on these documents? And it's a matter of political debate in this town and in Israel. if the documents show any ongoing nuclear activity, that's obviously a matter of grave importance because it would signal a violation of the JCPOA. If it's stuff that refers to past work, which in fact it all refers to past work, it still is very relevant because there are some sites that the IAEA may need to see. But how IAEA then, what is the peg for them to ask to go to see it? For example, these tunnels that at Parchin that were the subject of a latest report by the so-called good ISIS. I don't think there were any nuclear activity that was, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to disparage them at all. They're a good organization. The activity, I don't know that it involved nuclear work per se, so the IEA might not have a peg. Still, they should ask questions because they need to resolve underlying questions before they could ever give a broad conclusion under the additional protocol. As for the IEA's role in the procurement channel, if they come across any indications of dual use or other nuclear goods, they have to report them to the Secretariat, the UN Secretariat. That's the body that took over the investigative role that had previously been played by the panel of experts. But the Secretariat of the UN Secretariat doesn't have they don't really have an enforcement role, and they don't have a very strong investigative capacity either. They're the ones that write the 6-month reports about implementation of the procurement channel. So the evidence that all states are obliged to report to them of any indications of something that's come up. And I believe the IEA is obliged, although you're looking at me quizzically, so I better check into that.
In the second row, please, Bob Einhorn.
Bob Einhorn, Brookings. Thank you, Mark and Mike. I look forward to reading your book. Question for Mark. On the relationship between U.S. objectives toward Iran's nuclear program and U.S. objectives toward addressing the broader Iranian challenge, range of its support for proxies, intervention in Syria, human rights, and so forth. The Obama administration decided to confine negotiations to the nuclear issue. And one of the major criticisms of the JCPOA was that it didn't address missiles, as you point out, but also that the sanctions relief provided resources that Iran could apply to its mischief-making in the region and so forth. And so, as a result, the Trump administration says it wants a comprehensive deal, a new deal, a comprehensive deal that would address a full range of activities, and Secretary Pompeo has enumerated 12 requirements for such a deal, which Brian Hook says ought to be in treaty form. So what is your view? What is the relationship? Should the Trump administration or a successor conclude another separate nuclear deal, a separate nuclear plus missile deal, or should seek to deal with these other matters? And let me just ask a question to Mike. If the U.S. wants to constrain, and Europeans also want to constrain, Iran's missile capabilities, how do we go about it? Can you imagine an agreement with the Iranians on their missile capabilities, given their investment in that as a critical component of their defense? Can we imagine any voluntary restraint more than what the Supreme Leader has said, which is that they don't have a strategic need for missiles greater than 2,000 kilometers in range?
So, Bob, I borrowed a line from one of our mutual colleagues, and I'm a little bit ashamed that I didn't credit him with this, because I said that the nuclear program is a first-order threat to international security and non-proliferation, and the other issues are problematic, and you could describe them in other adjectives, but they're not first-order threats. They're second- and third-order issues. So I really thought that dealing with the nuclear issue, and another way of looking at it is that if I were a Saudi citizen, I might think that the regional issues were the most important. And maybe if I was an Israeli, I might think that. But even Israeli strategists say dealing with the nuclear issue removed the greatest threat to Israel for the time being. So the idea was that dealing with the big issue would have provided a basis then for dealing with all the other issues. And I think it's such a waste that none of that happened because of the animosity directed toward the deal. Oh, was there?
I think Mike was going to come in.
Yeah. Thank you, Bob. That's you asked the kind of the most important set of questions regarding missiles. And so I look at Iran's missiles and see, four major categories of concern. One is that they could be used to deliver nuclear weapons. That's what the JCPOA attempts to address, to constrain Iran from being able to build a nuclear weapon to put atop one of its missiles. The other that's frequently mentioned, and I think by the Trump administration, and I think it's because of their experience watching North Korea develop some ICBMs, is, there's a fear that Iran's long-term plans are to develop an ICBM. They probably have that as a hedging strategy along with their nuclear hedging. But I don't see any definitive steps that Iran is taking today that leads me to believe that that's what they want to do. But there are ways to address it. And in fact, if I could self-promote something, if you go to their website, I did write an article on reducing the risks of Iran developing an ICBM, and that is capturing Iran's voluntary commitment that they will not develop a missile capable of flying more than 2,000 kilometers. To do that, I think it's relatively simple to verify that they're not testing missiles that fly further than 2,000 kilometers. And the Khorramshahr, they claim it only flies 2,000 kilometers, but it has a very heavy warhead. You lighten that load, it exceeds it. So that is a problem. And as I mentioned at the end of my remarks, to me, this is one of the major issues that I see. You have to deal with the space launch capacity. I think if you put certain technical and operational restrictions on satellite launching activities, you can manage the threat that what they learn from doing space launches will not decisively enable them to move towards an ICBM quickly. The other two issues are, Iran's missiles do pose a strategic threat to its neighbors in the Gulf, and by extension, U.S. forces in the Gulf. This is not necessarily so much a military threat as it is one to coerce, and threaten the neighbors. The actual end results, conventionally armed missiles have historically killed on the order of 2 to 3 people when they're armed with a 1-ton warhead. It's regrettable, but it's not existential. And I don't know how to address that problem because the missiles are so fundamental to Iran's overall strategy for deterring attack or defending against an attack. The last one is probably the most difficult to address, and that's Iran's supplying of missiles to non-state or sub-state actors, namely Hezbollah, and we see it with the Houthis as well. I've been trying to search for answers to that question, and it's a really difficult one. But I would note that, yeah, the Israelis are taking one measure, but it's interesting to note that in 2006, of the 4,400 rockets that Hezbollah actually used against Israel, all but one was of Syrian origin or production. They were not Iranian missiles, with the exception of a Fajr 5, which landed regrettably in Haifa and killed a number of people. So it raises the question of the 150,000 rockets that Hezbollah has, how many are from Iran and how many are from Syria? If I'm Israeli, I don't really care where they're made. But I think we need to look at this issue and define and maybe limit what Iran does transfer and come to some kind of agreement. But I don't know how to get there.
Next question.
Yes, Edward F. Stanford. Michael, could you say a little more about the difference between missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads and those that are not, and how one would verify that? I mean, even with intrusive on-site inspection, we have difficulty demonstrating to the Russians the difference between bombers equipped for nuclear weapons and those that are not so equipped. Thank you.
Differentiating them is difficult because it's not as simple as just changing a conventional warhead to a nuclear warhead. There's different instrumentation and power supplies and things like that that you need to include in it for nuclear weapons delivery. There are a number of other technical requirements, but a lot of that could be contained within the nose cone or the warhead, it's a reentry vehicle itself. So I'm not sure there is a foolproof way to distinguish a missile that's armed with a nuclear or conventional warhead. It's certainly not possible to do it when you see it take off. You know, it's covered. And that's, I think, one reason that the language in the Security Council Resolution 2231 talks about design intent, which is very subjective, difficult to define. We've made a first attempt at it. You know, it would be great if others followed on and you know, presented some new ideas, even criticism to what we've done. I don't think we tried to come up with a definitive definition or categorization, but it's one that maybe people could build upon.
I think Ed Levine was next.
Edward Levine, Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. I worry a bit when we tell the IAEA to do something in order to reach the broad conclusion. And the reason I worry is because, at least as I read the JCPOA years ago, it seemed to me that there was no real reason why the broad conclusion had to be reached, that Iran could get everything it wanted while allowing the IAEA to fail in that regard. That leads me to a more general proposal or question. Perhaps as the remaining parties to the agreement try to work out means of preserving it, they ought to stress verification in a positive way as a sign of their commitment to the agreement that could balance the sort of negative approach of, gee, is there a way that we can get around the US sanctions, which to some extent leaves the Europeans looking desperate rather than looking like four square proponents of the agreement.
I'm going to propose that we take the two questions on the aisle right there and then allow you to just answer them as a group.
Thank you. Hans Benendijk from the Atlantic Council in Rand. I have sort of unfair political question for you. We are entering the presidential campaign season here in the United States, and I'd love to get your thoughts on how a Democratic candidate might posture him or herself on this issue. For example, might they say, if Iran continues to comply, the future Democratic administration might rejoin, or might they rejoin under certain circumstances if additional modifications are made, such as some of those that you suggested? Or should it be broadened? Bob talked about the broader set of issues. How would you envision a Democratic candidate posturing him or herself on this?
Thank you. Mike, Mark, great presentations, very thoughtful and complete. Chris Bidwell from the Federation of American Scientists. My question is a simple one to Mike. Mike, you mentioned that there was objections to putting missiles in the JCPOA from both China and Russia. And did they articulate those reasons? And if so, can you give us a little insight as to what they were and why they were? Thank you.
Okay, the difficulty of having smart people in the audience is they pose really, really tricky questions. Yeah, Ed is absolutely right about the broad conclusion. Iran doesn't need it to be able to get the other restrictions on missiles and arms exports and imports in the 2231 resolution overcome. But as long as there's not a broad conclusion, I think the parties, led by the United States, would have strong reason to not want to see an end to the limitations under the agreement. And I've always thought that if we get to that point where the limitations would come off without the broad conclusion, I don't think the political I don't think there's a political viability to consider that Iran should be free to do anything when underlying questions remain. So that's why I emphasize the broad conclusion. Plus, I think it's the only basis I can see where Iran has an incentive to allow inspection. So I'm trying to find something positive, and to get to your second point about, can't the Europeans, do something positive? But the thing is, Europeans, they have to do something to keep Iran in the deal, and that's why they're trying to find ways to maintain. They're not trying to evade U.S. sanctions. They're trying to keep their business connections with Iran firm. And this gets to Hans's question about what should a future candidates posture? How should they posture on this issue? They should say that the United States will come back into compliance with its obligations. And as long as Iran is complying, that the United States should also comply. They should work toward addressing the other issues that Iran poses. I think they should advocate improving the deal, but they shouldn't make it a condition for honoring American obligations. I don't think that's a hard political sell. I mean, well, it'll be a political question, but to me, it's a matter of U.S. obligations and what would maintain a better international security and non-proliferation regime. It's going back into the deal.
Thank you, Chris. I'm not going to try to answer the political question. I'm just a stupid engineer. So Chris, I'm not aware of the specific concerns the Russians and the Chinese had. Perhaps Mark or Bob or some other people in the audience might be able to address the specifics of their concerns. But I suspect that it centers on the futility of trying to get Iran to constrain its missile programs in a formal way in the context of nuclear weapons or nuclear developments. As I mentioned, this idea that Iran would even relinquish any of their current systems, I think, was kind of a unicorn notion. These are fundamental to its identity and to its defense and deterrence strategy. Remember, they haven't imported aircraft in how long? I mean, if you want to see a great museum piece of military hardware, an aircraft, go to Iran and see it. And in fact, we had another project where we looked at how Iran would recapitalize its military capabilities in 2020 when the restrictions on arms exports to Iran would be lifted under 2231. And we concluded, and this was a kind of a broad spectrum of experts on Iran, that they would go out and purchase some additional aircraft, but their central capacity to strike targets beyond its borders would remain with ballistic missiles. It's just less expensive. It's a part of who they are, and it satisfies their strategic needs for the time being. I think those attitudes might shift if, born from their experience in Syria, where they've seen the value of air support in ground campaigns. But nonetheless, the conclusion was, aircraft, a small additional set of aircraft would be sufficient for Iran's needs today. If I could conclude just on one short remark, other than thanking Mark for 10 wonderful years, and I wish him best in retirement. But when Mark was the executive director, he had a specific rule about the socks people wore while they were on stage. And I adhered to that rule, but I just noticed that Mark has some pretty bright socks. And is this what retirement does to you, Mark?
Yeah, you break the rules.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but do come up and admire his socks if you'd like. Buy the book. And thank you all for coming, and join me in thanking Mark Fitzpatrick and Mike Elleman.